property and that we had found some. 45 miles north of Davenport on Highway 25, get to Fruitland, turn right, go about 4 miles. We found 50 acres that had a 30 by 50 shop. There's a double wide trailer there, but there's also 3 septic tanks, telephone, electricity, and just really great for the camp. And we agreed and we put in a bid for it. Was turned down. Somebody else had put in a bid. We re-offered, and our offer was accepted. And we've got the down payment, so we have a new camp. So we're all excited about that. This is something that we have been trying to do for the camp for years, because Camp Princess Pine was not meeting our needs anymore, and this year the 4-H was really short on money, and literally, according to the pictures that we've seen, clear cut every single pine tree off of Camp Princess Pine. So now it's Camp Princess No Pines. But so we now have our camp. We won't have any youth camps this year. We will have a family camp probably at the end of the year if we can get some areas cleared out for campsites. But that's our goal for this year, is having at least family camp and getting people up there and getting tractors and just making our own camp. So we're excited. Anyway, back on to David and Goliath, our last lesson. I just want to do a quick refresh for those who might not have been here so you can know what we're talking about. This is a recent, I don't know what the year is, photo of the battleground where this has been taking place over the last 4 weeks. This is Soka. Turn it on. This is Soka up here. That's kind of what started this whole battle, because the Philistines had come over from their area and had taken this city that belonged to Judah. And we read that the Philistines were camped between Soka and Asaka. And so really the only mountain they could be at would be this one here, is where the Philistines are encamped. And as we'll look at again, we've been looking at, they've been up there for at least 40 days, taunting the Israelites, who are on this, probably on this mountain, is what people really agree on. And this is what I had brought up last week on the map, and you'll see it about the end of the lesson, the Kerbet, meaning ruins, and whatever that is, Kayafa. I told you sometimes it's spelled with a K or a Q, and that's this area here that they are excavating and coming up with a lot of information about this area through the excavation of that town. Of course, Gath is where Goliath is from, and this is the valley of Elah, or the Elah Valley. This is where the battle is going to take place today. And of course, you can just barely see here this brook that comes through here, and that's where we left off last week, that David had collected his 5 stones from that actual creek, or brook as they refer to it in the scripture. So that's where we're going to be at this week. Last week we left off in verse 40, kind of a cliffhanger that you always see at the end of a season of a show. Then David took his staff in his hand, which is his shepherd's staff, and he chose for him the 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag. And I would assume it'd be a small, smooth stone, maybe a little bit more rounder, but about this size to fit into his shepherd's bag and to fit in his slingshot. And that's what he's going up against Goliath with, is just one of these. People ask the question, why did David pick 5 stones up out of the brook? If he knew God was on his side and he trusted that God was going to be with him, why didn't he just pick up 1 stone? Because that was all he needed. The Bible doesn't say. We don't know what was going through David's head. Maybe that's just what he felt comfortable with and picking up. Maybe he felt, if he dropped one, he'd have a second one or whatever. It doesn't matter. He had one. That was all he needed. Okay? In 1 Samuel 17, where this is taking place, like I said, we're going to be starting in verse 41 if you want to follow along in your Bible. But I want to do a quick review of the battlefront. The Israelites have gathered, like I said, on that one mountainside. They've been there for 40 days, listening to Goliath come down every morning and every evening and blaspheme, the Israelites and God, telling them that, just defying them in every way he can. And the Israelites were scared. Nobody wanted to go down and face Goliath one-on-one. They knew they would be killed. And so they're kind of like huddled up on their mountainside, waiting. The Philistines are gathered up on the other side of the Elon Valley that we just saw. And they're ready to do battle. But they've got an ace up their sleeve, and they're hoping that by sending Goliath out there and them agreeing, the Israelites agreeing to sending one man out and just do one-on-one, and instead of wasting thousands or hundreds of people, let's do it just one-on-one. One person is going to lose one man, and that decides the battle. And of course, Goliath is 9 foot 6 inches tall. Nobody in the Israelite army is stupid enough to go against this, okay? Because he's in full battle array, and we've already talked about his armor. For 40 days and 40 nights, Goliath has come down into the valley and screamed up at the Israelites, "Send somebody down here to fight me." And his calls go unanswered. But in verse 41, Goliath steps out with his shield bearer, walking in front of him, because both sides have agreed, I guess, for whatever reason, that after 40 days, nobody's going to come down. It's time to do battle. So the Israelites, as we read last week, have suited up, and they're starting to yell and scream and psych each other up. And the Philistines have suited up, and they're coming down, ready to do battle. Goliath steps out in front with his shield bearer. David steps out with his staff and his slingshot. When the Israelites see Goliath, that he's still with them, they turn and run and go back up their hillside, leaving David out there by himself. They're like, okay, sorry, if Goliath is in the mix, even though we've got thousands, we're not going against him. And they turn and run and leave David out there by himself, facing not only Goliath, but the whole Philistine army. And David takes a few steps closer, and Goliath takes a few steps closer. And Goliath sees David, and he disdains him, for he is a teenager, ruddy complexion and good looking. Goliath can tell right away that David is not a hardened soldier in any way, but a boy. So Goliath yells out to David, "Am I a dog that you come out to me with sticks?" Then Goliath does what he does best. He cursed David by his gods. Then Goliath said, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And then I want us to read verses 45 through 47. This is a response of David to Goliath. Then David said to Goliath, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you, and I will take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines, not just yours, but your camp of the Philistines, to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." So do we have this same kind of tenacity and power and confidence and assurance and strength when we face our giants? David knows without a doubt who is going to win this fight. He doesn't have to have armor and weapons of war to defeat Goliath, because he has the one and only true God on his side. Just like we do every single day when we face our own giants, we need to have that same confidence that David has. So Goliath started towards David. David runs toward not only Goliath, but the whole Philistine army that is standing behind him. Talk about confidence as a teenager. Talk about somebody who knows and trusts in his God no matter what. This is either going to be a really short run to defeat for David or a short run to a massive victory. David is sure that it's going to be a victory. David reaches into his shepherd's sack and withdrew a single stone. He placed it in his sling. And again, this isn't the kind of slingshot that we have today where you grab it and you've got the two bands. It's a band, a strap like you see here that ties one to his wrist. It comes down to the pocket where he'd put the stone, and then the other strap comes up and he holds onto it. And then he starts slinging it around and around and around and gets the velocity and all that he wants. And he's done it so many times. Remember, he's a shepherd, bored, stiff, day in and day out, sitting there in the field watching his sheep eat grass and eat grass and eat grass. What else is a shepherd boy to do but to learn how to throw a rock? And he would set something up and he would sit there and practice it and practice it and practice it. Because as we learned last week, he's having to face lions and bears with a staff and a slingshot. So he needs to be good at it. So David is good at it and confident enough in what he's going to do with that one rock that he's walked up and faced this giant and this army. So David is slinging and twirling, and he gets up to whatever velocity and speed and whatever, and he releases that one string. That rock comes flying out and hits Goliath between the eyes, hits him in the forehead. The rock hit Goliath with so much power that the rock sank into his forehead, knocking Goliath out. Goliath fell forward and landed on his face. Verse 50 tells us, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. This has to be one of the greatest battles that really never happened. The battle between two armies. The Philistines are all pumped up to fight, and the war, it is over before it can even get started. This has to be the shortest war in history. But David wasn't finished, was he? He doesn't have a sword. So he runs over to Goliath and unsheathes Goliath's sword and cuts off his head. And of course, Goliath's sword is probably, I'm going to say maybe this tall. Something that a 9-foot, 6-inch Goliath of a giant could wield ferociously. But David drew his sword and cut his head off. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And this is the map that we have seen before. Here again was the ruins I was talking about. Saka and Aska, the battle is in here. And when you read the scriptures, the Israelites chased the Philistines back to where Goliath was from, Gath, and also all the way up to Ekron. They chased them back. And when the Philistines returned from chasing the Philistines and killing them, they plundered the Philistines' tents. David took the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, but he put Goliath's armor in his tent. Now, David had just gotten to the battlefront, and it doesn't talk about him making a tent or anything to stay in. So I'm going to assume that the way this is put in here, that David took Goliath's head to Jerusalem, and as you can see here, in order for him to go from the battlefield up to Jerusalem, he would have had to have gone by or through Bethlehem, where David was from. So I'm assuming that maybe when he's out in the field with his sheep, that maybe he has a tent there. And that he has taken the armor of Goliath and put it in his tent. This doesn't say where his tent is. I'm just assuming that because it talks about him going to Jerusalem, that maybe he stopped by Bethlehem and left his armor there. But David won not only his personal battle with the giant Goliath, but the Israelites' army finally has gone over their battle fright, thanks to David, and they have chased the Philistines back to their homeland, leaving their dead bodies scattered all over the land for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field to eat, just like David had prophesied. David's prophecy of how the battle would turn out was true and factual because of his faith and trust in God. David brought a smooth stone to a sword fight against all odds, and he won. I want to read the lyrics to a Christian song. It is by Casting Crowns, and it is titled Nobody. And I hope I can read it without singing it. Too many times when I read a song, I start singing it. So, why you ever chose me has always been a mystery. All my life, I've been told I belong at the end of the line with all the other not quites, with all the never get it rights, but it turns out they are the ones you are looking for all the time. Because I'm just a nobody trying to tell everybody all about somebody who saved my soul. Ever since you rescued me, you gave my heart a song to sing. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. Moses had stage fright, and David brought a rock to a sword fight. You picked 12 outsiders nobody would have chosen, and you changed the world. Well, the moral of this story is everybody's got a purpose. So when I hear that devil start talking to me, saying, "Who do you think you are?" I say, I'm just a nobody, trying to tell everybody all about somebody who saved my soul. Ever since you rescued me, you gave my heart a song to sing. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. So let me go down, down, down in history as another blood-bought, faithful member of the family. And if they all forget my name, well, that's fine with me. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. Let me go down, down, down in history as another blood-brought, faithful member of the family. And if they all forget my name, well, that's fine with me. I'm just living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. I'm just a nobody trying to tell everybody all about somebody who saved my soul. Ever since you rescued me, you gave my heart a song to sing. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. I'm living for the world to see, nobody but Jesus. This is a beautiful song with a very powerful message. Everybody on that battle scene saw God acting through David. Everybody saw the one and only true God that day through David, just as he had prophesied. Let us remember every day that we are just a nobody, trying to tell everybody that we come into contact with about somebody who saved our soul. David was a nobody at the time, and just like you probably feel that you might be about sometimes. He was the youngest of 8 sons. He was a teenage shepherd tasked with tending his family's sheep. But when nobody in Saul's army had the strength or the courage to take the stand against Goliath, defying not only their honor, but the honor of their God, it took a nobody shepherd boy to take a rock to face a giant with a giant sword. So I want to take a few minutes and look at the attributes of David and what led him to this faithful event. Well, of course, as we read the scriptures, we read where David was responsible. David had a responsibility to tend to his family's sheep. Remember when we read that he would go and visit Saul and play his harp for him because of his troubled soul. But David would leave Saul and go back home to tend to his sheep. That's showing how David was responsible. And when David would go and visit him out on the battlefront, he would still go back home. When we looked at it last week, that 15-mile trip was over a mountain range. But David would go back home, that 15 miles over the mountains, to tend to his family sheep. He was a responsible young man, and he took it seriously. How do we treat our responsibilities? Do we treat them with the same determination as David? David was obedient. His father Jesse wanted David to go to the battle and take his 3 oldest brothers some food and to bring back a report to him on how the battle was going and how his sons were up there in that battlefront. Imagine the look on Jesse's face when David stopped by home on his way to Jerusalem, and his father came out to greet him to see how his sons were doing at the battlefront, and his youngest son reaches into a sack and pulls out the severed head of Goliath. Well, Dad, things didn't go quite as planned. They went better. Imagine how Jesse felt that he had sent his youngest son up there just to take some food, and he ends up being the battle hero, taking on a 9 foot 6 inch giant, took his head off with a sword, and here he is carrying his head around, taking it up to Jerusalem. The Bible doesn't state that this is what happened, that David went home and talked to his family, but again, in order to get from where he was at, he had to go through his hometown, and what teenage boy wouldn't have stopped by to talk to his family, especially when we see how responsible and obedient David was. And he didn't go there to brag about his accomplishments on the battlefield, but to check in with his family and probably to check in on his sheep because he had been away. Imagine how his family reacted to his story about his hand-to-hand combat with a giant, how he faced a sword-wielding giant with nothing but a slingshot and a smooth stone. But David was obedient when his father tasked him with taking food to his brothers, and obedient in tending to a sheep while he was gone. The next thing we see is that David was courageous. Not a single soldier, not even his 3 oldest brothers, who had just ridiculed him for just showing up at the battle scene, they did not have the courage to face Goliath. But David had the courage because he knew God watched over him and protected him when he faced the bear and the lion when he was watching his sheep. David knew that the one true God, the God of Israel, our same God today, would protect him against this uncircumcised Philistine. David overcame rejection. Remember, when we read about it, he went up to the battle scene, and his brothers, were ridiculing him. It's like, why are you here? You're just a teenage boy. You just came here to see the action, to see the excitement. The brothers accused him of being prideful and insolent of heart, thinking that he was just there to watch the fighting. His brothers didn't know that David was on the battlefield because he was being obedient to his father, who sent him there to bring them food and food to his captains. Okay? But David stood up to his brothers. Then David had to face and overcome the rejection by King Saul, who thought he was too young and inexperienced to fight a battle-hardened giant of a soldier who was in full battle array. And then David took on a godly cause. Goliath had walked out into the valley of Elon twice a day for 40 days and cursed not only the Israelite army, but their God, David's God, our God. And not a single soldier did anything about it. Nothing. They hid up on their mountainside for 40 days. They were content to just hide there and hopefully maybe he'd go away. They just took the verbal abuse day after day after day. But not David. He was on the scene for what I would guess was, a few minutes, an hour, whatever, and he'd heard enough from this man. He was not going to let him get away with defiling his king, his army, or his God. He was going to do something about it. David doesn't care about the size of his sword or the armor or the reward of the army standing behind Goliath. All David cares about is that Goliath is defiling his king, his God, and his king, and he's going to stop him. He took on this godly cause. David had a testimony. I once heard a brother who wasn't a Christian, who came out of the Protestant faith, say that he hated the Protestants for taking our joy away. He said you couldn't raise your hands during a worship service because you're acting like a Protestant. Or you couldn't say hallelujah or amen because you were acting like them. And it's kind of true. But we all have a story that we need to tell. We have a testimony of how God has worked in our lives and how we've been treated and everything else. And it's important that we tell that and that we share our stories with each other of how God has worked in your lives and how he's protected you. And we need to tell those stories. And that's what David does here to Saul. You know, when Saul says, you're too young, you're inexperienced, you can't go. Well, Saul, wait a minute. God is on my side. You know, when I went against the bear with nothing but this same staff and this same slingshot, I killed the bear. When I went against the lion, I had this staff and this slingshot. I even grabbed the lion by his chinny chin, you know, by his beard. But God, I always think about you. But God was with me, and God will be with me today. Last week after services, we went over to Crystal's house, and she's got this new, I guess you could call it a gaming console or whatever, but it's virtual reality, and it's this headset you put on, and you're transported to wherever. I did it last week. It's a 360-degree camera, so when you look up, down, around, it's like I'm standing here right now, but I'm not. And I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, the home of the Blue Angels, and so they're dear to me. And we used to watch them all the time, fly over our house. They could read, you know, what was written on the plane because we lived right at the end of the runway. And last Sunday, she let me fly with the Blue Angels. And I'm looking around, and I got a pilot in front of me, a co-pilot, and I'm looking at it as we're flying in formation, you know, and it's just like I was there, and I was doing the barrel rolls with them and losing my balance and, you know, doing, you know, just everything. Then the next one she put on was I appeared, and I'm looking around, and there's a fence. I'm in a fenced yard, and there's people standing along this fence row with cameras. I was like, oh, that can't be good. And I look in all four corners of this field, and there's a large dead animal. And then I look back over on this way, and here comes 4 lions, 2 male and 2 female, and they look to be almost perfectly white, albino type, or just really, really faded yellow. And they go to the corners to eat on these dead animals. Well, one lion comes at me, and I'm not this tall. I'm, you know, about maybe this tall because I'm a 360-degree camera on a tripod. And this lion comes up to see what this is, and literally is right here face to face with this lion. And I look down at its paw, and it's as big as my hand. And he's right here. And first thing I thought of was David and how he would grab the beard of that lion to fight it. And I'm thinking, there's no way. You know, I'm sitting here trying to grab it, and it's like, how in the world could David, a teenager with nothing but a staff and a slingshot, grab this lion? But that's what he did. That was his testimony to Saul. When David came, this lion came after me, God was there, and he took care of it. David used his own armor. Be who God made you to be. We can't turn into people that other people want us to be. And we can't turn other people into who we want them to be. We have to be our own person. Saul tried to get David to wear his armor. but it was too big and uncomfortable, and David didn't feel right in it because it wasn't tested, as he put it. And he took it off. He says, I need to be who I am. I'm a shepherd boy with a staff and a slingshot. I have defended against a bear. I've defended against a lion. Goliath is nothing with God on my side. David defeated his giant. We all face giants today in our life. David's giant was called Goliath. Some people face a giant called alcoholism, where somebody else might have a giant called drug addiction. Others might face a giant called liar because they have a problem telling the truth, where another Christian might have a giant called loose lips because they're always talking about other people. We studied in the New Testament in the book of James, where James teaches us that our tongue is like the rudder of a ship. It's a small member compared to the rest of our body, but that small tongue, that small member controls our whole body, just like that rudder controls a ship. Or we might be facing the giant called the gambler because we can't stop pulling that one-armed bandit, or betting on cards, or taking a penny and scratching off tickets, hoping that we'll get that one big win. You have this uncontrollable urge to beat the odds. Maybe you're facing the giant called loneliness. Remember, you are not alone. You have a family right here to stop that giant. But we have to have faith in our God and confidence in our God like David did when he faced that giant. And the last one is David stood up for God and what he believed in, no matter the outside pressure. This goes in line with David overcoming rejection. Even though David was getting pressure and harassed by his 3 oldest brothers about being at the battlefront, David didn't back down. He didn't let the family pressure deter him from his faith and commitment in God. Even though his king, Saul, tried to convince him that he was just a mere shepherd boy with no fighting experience, David didn't let Saul talk him out of doing what was right, to defend his country's honor and to put an end to Goliath defying his God. David didn't let the fact that he could not fit into the armor of his king to protect him from Goliath's weapon stop him from marching out into that valley and putting an end to Goliath. What would you have to overcome to stand up for our God? Which, by the way, is the same God David was fighting for. What do you have to overcome in your life to fight for a cause? Who have you had to fight, and what peer pressure have you had to overcome sin in your life? Well, this concludes our 4-part study of David and Goliath. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this famous story as much as I have had in studying 1 Samuel 15, 16, and 17, and putting these lessons together to bring them to you. I hope I've brought them in a way that maybe you haven't seen or heard it before. And maybe I've shown you something different that you hadn't thought of in this story. Like I said, I've enjoyed it. But the time has come again, like we do every Sunday, to where it's now in your hands. Maybe you are facing giants, and you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters to help to overcome those giants in your life, whatever that is. Because with God on our side, just like David saw, what David knew in the bottom of his heart to be true, that with God on his side, this giant was nothing. And David proved it with just a small rock against a mighty sword. How true and how powerful his God was. That his God didn't need a sword. All his God needed was a smooth rock. Or maybe you haven't put Christ on in baptism yet, and that's something that you decide that you need to do. We're here. The baptistry is ready. All we ask is that you let your wishes be